Meryl Streep walked into a family-owned restaurant in Harbour Ridge and was publicly denied service. But instead of walking away in anger, she did something no one saw coming. Within days, the entire town was turned upside down, and what happened next left even her harshest critics in shock. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The late afternoon sun painted golden streaks across the weathered boardwalk of Harbour Ridge, a small coastal town that seemed frozen in time. Its charm was simple: salt-worn buildings, family-owned shops, and Eleanor's Harbour Kitchen, a modest restaurant that sat overlooking the marina. The sign above the door swayed gently in the ocean breeze, its blue letters faded, but still inviting. Meryl Streep parked her car in the small lot beside the restaurant and sat for a moment, enjoying the peaceful anonymity that Harbour Ridge seemed to offer. Dressed in a simple linen shirt, casual pants, and minimal makeup, she didn't look like a 21-time Oscar nominee. She looked like any other visitor seeking respite in this quiet seaside town. Meryl had been filming on location just 2 hours away and had heard about this place from a crew member who grew up nearby. Best clam chowder on the East Coast, he'd promised. After weeks of intense scenes and publicity, she craved something authentic and quiet. As she entered the restaurant, the small brass bell above the door announced her arrival. Heads turned, as they naturally do in small towns when a newcomer appears, but quickly returned to their conversations. All except for one pair of eyes. Sophie Wilson, the young waitress working the early dinner shift, froze with a water pitcher in hand. Her gaze widened in recognition, and she quickly composed herself, setting down the pitcher and smoothing her apron. "Good evening," Sophie greeted with a warm smile as she approached. "Welcome to Eleanor's. Table for one?" Meryl smiled back. "Yes, please, something with a view, if possible." Sophie nodded and led her to a corner table by the window, overlooking the harbour, where fishing boats gently rocked in the evening tide. "Our special today is fresh-caught halibut with lemon herb butter. The clam chowder's also wonderful made. Fresh this morning." "I've heard about the chowder," Meryl replied. "I'd love to try it." Sophie disappeared to place the order, her hands slightly trembling with excitement. The restaurant wasn't fancy. Its wooden tables were worn smooth from decades of use, and the nautical decorations spoke of authenticity rather than pretense. Black and white photographs lined the walls, showing Harbour Ridge through the decades, its fishing fleet once prosperous, its streets once bustling. From behind the counter, Eleanor Wilson watched the scene unfold. In her mid-60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes sharpened by years of hard work, Eleanor had built this restaurant from nothing after her husband's passing. She'd poured everything into it, their savings, their dreams, their future, and lately it had been barely enough to stay afloat as Harbour Ridge's economy declined. Eleanor's gaze never left Meryl as she wiped down an already clean countertop. 3 days earlier, she had watched an interview where Meryl had taken a stance on an issue that struck at Eleanor's core beliefs. The words had felt like a personal affront, dismissive of values Eleanor had structured her life around. Setting. Her cloth aside, Eleanor straightened her apron and moved deliberately toward Meryl's table. Her steps were measured, her jaw set with determination. Sophie, returning with a glass of water, noticed her mother's expression and felt her stomach tighten. "Mom," she whispered as they passed. "Don't." But Eleanor continued, stopping directly. Beside Meryl's table, Meryl looked up, her expression open and pleasant. "Hello," Meryl said with a courteous nod. Eleanor didn't return the greeting. She drew in a breath, her voice low but firm. "Miss Streep, I know who you are." "It's a pleasure to meet you," Meryl responded, a hint of confusion crossing her features. "This is a lovely restaurant." "I can't serve you today," Eleanor said evenly, her hands clasped in front of her. "Not after what you said in that interview on Tuesday." A hush fell over the nearby tables. Sophie stood frozen by the counter, mortified. Meryl was silent for a moment, understanding dawning in her eyes. She didn't become defensive or angry. Instead, she nodded slowly, a thoughtful expression on her face. "I see," she said finally, her voice gentle. "I respect that this is your establishment." Eleanor had braced herself for outrage, for a scene, for the entitled reaction celebrities were known for. She hadn't expected this calm acceptance. Meryl gathered her purse and stood, her movements graceful and unhurried. She reached into her wallet and placed a $20 bill on the table. "For your time," she said simply, "and for what it's worth, I believe people can disagree and still treat each other with dignity." She turned toward the door, the eyes of every patron following her. The brass bell chimed softly as she left, and for several seconds afterward, the restaurant remained eerily quiet. Outside, Meryl paused on the boardwalk, taking in the view of fishing boats bobbing gently against the darkening sky. She wasn't angry. Disappointment, perhaps, but not anger. She understood that her public words carried weight, that they reached into places and lives she'd never see, and she respected Eleanor's right to her own beliefs, even if they led to this moment. Inside, Sophie approached her mother, her voice hushed but intense. "Mum, how could you? That was Meryl Streep." Eleanor's expression remained resolute, but something flickered in her eyes, uncertainty perhaps. "This restaurant stands for something," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "It stands for hospitality," Sophie countered, then turned away to attend to her other tables, embarrassment burning her cheeks. Eleanor returned to the counter, suddenly aware of the whispers circulating through her restaurant. She'd expected to feel righteous, vindicated. Instead, she felt hollow as she watched through the window, while Meryl Streep walked along the boardwalk, pausing to admire the sunset, casting its final glow over Harbour Ridge. What Eleanor Wilson couldn't know, what no one in Harbour Ridge could possibly predict, was that Meryl Streep wouldn't just walk away. The moment that had unfolded in Eleanor's harbour kitchen would set in motion events that would transform not just the restaurant, but the entire struggling town, and it would begin, not with confrontation, but with an act of unexpected grace that would leave everyone questioning what they thought they knew about forgiveness, understanding, and the power of responding to rejection with kindness. As Meryl drove away from Harbour Ridge, her mind wasn't on the rejection. It was on something much more important, a decision that would change everything. The rumble of Meryl Streep's car engine faded as she drove away from Harbour Ridge, but inside her mind, thoughts swirled like the evening fog rolling in from the sea. She followed the coastal road until she came upon a small turnout overlooking the ocean. Pulling over, she cut the engine and sat in silence, watching waves crash against the rocky shore below. Meryl wasn't angry. After decades in the public eye, she'd grown accustomed to people forming opinions about her, based on sound bites and headlines. What saddened her was how divided the world had become, how a difference in viewpoints could create such impenetrable walls between people. She took out her phone, scrolling past dozens of emails and messages. Her publicist would tell her to ignore what had happened, to never mention Eleanor's harbour kitchen again. That would be the expected response. Silence or indignation. But Meryl had never been interested in meeting expectations. She opened her social media app, her thumbs hovering over the screen. For several minutes she composed her thoughts, deleted them, rewrote them. Finally, satisfied, she pressed post. It read, "Just driving through the beautiful town of Harbour Ridge. If you're ever in the area, Eleanor's Harbour Kitchen has a wonderful view of the marina. Supporting local businesses matters, especially in these challenging times." Small-town America. Support local. No mention of being denied service, no bitterness, no call for her millions of followers to boycott or protest, just genuine appreciation for a struggling town and its small businesses. She set her phone down, started her car, and continued toward her hotel, unaware that her simple act of grace had just lit a fuse. By morning, Meryl's post had gone viral. Comments flooded in. "Wait, isn't this the restaurant that refused to serve her? Only Meryl Streep would promote a place that turned her away. This is class personified. What happened at this restaurant? Someone explain." The post caught the attention of Rebecca Chen, an ambitious features journalist for the Atlantic Coast, who recognized a story worth pursuing. Unlike the tabloid reporters chasing scandal, Rebecca was drawn to human complexity, and Meryl's unexpected response to rejection was certainly complex. "Marcus," she called to her editor across the newsroom, "I need 2 days to follow up on something in Harbour Ridge." Meanwhile, in Harbour Ridge, Eleanor Wilson unlocked the restaurant door at 6 a.m. as she had every morning for 23 years. The routine was comforting, brewing coffee, prepping vegetables for the day's soup, wiping down tables that were already clean. But today something felt different. Sophie burst through the door at 6:30, her eyes wide, phone clutched in her hand. "Mom," she said breathlessly, "you need to see this." Eleanor took the phone, adjusting her reading glasses. Her expression hardened as she read Meryl Streep's post, then softened into confusion. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why would she—" "Because she's a better person than either of us gave her credit for," Sophie replied, taking back her phone. "You turned her away and she sent people our way anyway." Eleanor turned back to her vegetable chopping, knife moving more forcefully than necessary. "It doesn't change anything," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. By noon, the first curious visitors began arriving. A couple from Portsmouth asked for the table where Meryl sat. A group of college students took selfies by the entrance. As the afternoon progressed, more people came. Some genuinely hungry, others simply curious about the restaurant that had somehow earned a celebrity endorsement despite reportedly turning away its most famous patron. Sophie rushed between tables, coffee pot in hand, taking orders and answering the same questions repeatedly. Yes, Meryl Streep had been here. No, she couldn't comment on what happened. Yes, the clam chowder was their specialty. From behind the counter, Eleanor watched her dining room fill for the first time in months. The register rang steadily. The kitchen hummed with activity. It should have been a restaurateur's dream come true, but Eleanor felt a growing knot in her stomach, not pride but shame. At 3 p.m., a sleek rental car pulled into the parking lot. Rebecca Chen stepped out, notebook in hand, taking in the quaint scenery of Harbour Ridge before entering Eleanor's harbour kitchen. The bell chimed as she opened the door, announcing her arrival to a surprisingly packed restaurant. Rebecca sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and observed. She noticed the historic photographs on the walls, Harbour Ridge in its heyday, when fishing boats filled the harbour and the cannery employed half the town. She saw Sophie deftly handling the unexpected crowd, her smile genuine, but tired. Most of all, she watched Eleanor, whose hands trembled slightly as she rang up orders, whose eyes kept darting to the door as if expecting someone. "Busy day?" Rebecca asked when Eleanor refilled her coffee. Eleanor nodded curtly. "Unusually. Meryl Streep's post seems to have put you on the map." Eleanor's hand stilled. "Are you a reporter?" Rebecca offered her business card. "Features journalist. I'm interested in the story behind the post. What happened yesterday and why Ms. Streep would promote a restaurant that reportedly turned her away." Eleanor pocketed the card without looking at it. "No comment," she said firmly, moving to help another customer. As the dinner rush began, the restaurant reached capacity. Eleanor had to turn away patrons, a cruel irony not lost on her. By closing time, they had run out of clam chowder, fresh fish and pie. The tip jar overflowed. They'd made more money in one day than in the previous 2 weeks combined. After locking the door behind the last customer, Eleanor collapsed into a chair, exhaustion etched into the lines of her face. Sophie counted the day's earnings, a small smile playing on her lips. "We should call Aunt Martha to help tomorrow," Sophie suggested, "if it's going to be like this again." Eleanor nodded absently, her thoughts elsewhere. She pushed herself up and walked to the window, looking out at the harbour, the same view Meryl had admired just yesterday. "Why would she do that?" Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to Sophie. "After what I did?" Sophie approached, standing beside her mother. "Maybe that's the question you should be asking yourself," she said gently. "Not why she did what she did, but why you did what you did." Eleanor turned away, unable to meet her daughter's gaze. She busied herself wiping down the already clean counter, a habit when she was troubled. Outside, Rebecca Chen sat in her car making notes. This wasn't just a story about a celebrity encounter gone wrong. It was about a struggling town, a dying industry, a mother and daughter at a crossroads, and a simple act of kindness that might change everything. What Rebecca couldn't know, what no one in Harbour Ridge yet realized, was that Meryl Streep's unexpected response was just the beginning. The real transformation was still to come, and it would start with something even more surprising, a letter of apology from a proud woman who had never found it easy to admit when she was wrong. The sun hadn't yet broken over the horizon when Eleanor Wilson arrived at her restaurant the next morning. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, evidence of a restless night filled with troubling thoughts. She'd replayed her encounter with Meryl Streep countless times, each recollection more uncomfortable than the last. Inside, Eleanor moved through her morning routine mechanically, brewing coffee, preparing dough for the day's bread, checking inventory. But today, she found herself pausing before the old photographs on the wall. Harbour Ridge in better days, when fishing boats crowded the marina and the cannery whistle called workers to their shifts. Her father stood proudly on the dock in one weathered image, his arm around her mother. They had taught her values, honesty, hard work, and, she winced at the thought, hospitality to all. The bell above the door jingled as Sophie entered, earlier than usual and carrying grocery bags. "We're completely out of clams," Sophie explained, setting the bags on the counter. "Mr. Jensen at the market opened early for me. Said his phone's been ringing all morning with people asking if he supplies your restaurant." Eleanor nodded, taking the bags without comment. "Mom," Sophie ventured carefully, "we should talk about yesterday." Eleanor's hands stilled. "There's nothing to discuss, we have work to do." But there was plenty to discuss, and they both knew it. Eleanor had spent 20 years building her restaurant's reputation on good food and warm hospitality. In one moment, she had compromised those principles. The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Sophie called her friend Jamie to help wait tables, and Eleanor reluctantly agreed to phone her sister Martha for extra kitchen assistance. By 11, there was already a line forming outside. "This is insane," Jamie whispered to Sophie as they arranged silverware. "I didn't even know Harbour Ridge could get this busy anymore." It had been years since the town had seen such activity. Harbour Ridge had been slowly dying since the cannery closed, and commercial fishing declined. Young people moved away for college and never returned. Storefronts emptied. The harbour, once bustling with activity, now held more pleasure boats than working vessels. At precisely 11:30, Eleanor unlocked the door and the restaurant filled within minutes. Tourists, locals, and curious visitors from neighboring towns packed the tables. Conversations hummed with excitement, punctuated by the occasional not-so-subtle glance toward Eleanor. From the kitchen window, Eleanor watched Sophie navigate the crowded dining room, gracefully fielding questions with practiced deflection. She had her father's charm, Eleanor thought with a pang of pride and sadness. The lunch rush stretched into mid-afternoon without a lull. Eleanor's hands reddened from hot water and constant work, but she welcomed the distraction. If she kept moving, she wouldn't have to think about Meryl Streep or the growing unease in her chest. Martha appeared beside her, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. At 68, Martha moved more slowly than Eleanor, but worked with the precision. That came from decades of experience. "You've got a good thing here, Ellie," Martha said, using the childhood nickname Eleanor had long outgrown. "But something's eating at you." Eleanor shook her head dismissively. "Just tired." Martha's knowing gaze held steady. "You know, your father turned away a customer once, back in 76, when he ran the market." Eleanor looked up, surprised. Their father had been the most welcoming man in Harbour Ridge. Man came in drunk, spouting nastiness about old Mrs. Abernathy being Jewish, Martha continued. Dad refused to sell to him, told him to come back when he remembered his manners. "That's different," Eleanor protested. "Is it?" Martha raised an eyebrow. "Dad stood for something too, but he knew the difference between standing for decency and just being stubborn about opinions." Before Eleanor could respond, Sophie pushed through the kitchen doors, her cheeks flushed from exertion. "There's someone here you should meet," she said, gesturing for Eleanor to follow. Reluctantly, Eleanor wiped her hands and stepped into the dining room. At a corner table sat an elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes. Beside her was Rebecca Chen, the journalist from yesterday. "Mum, this is Martha Reynolds," Sophie said. "No relation," Martha chuckled, extending a fragile hand. "Though I've known your sister for years through the community garden." Eleanor nodded politely, aware of diners watching the interaction. "Mrs. Reynolds was just telling me something fascinating," Rebecca said, her notebook open before her. She knew Meryl Streep's mother years ago. Eleanor's carefully composed expression faltered. "You knew Mary Streep?" Martha Reynolds smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "We taught together briefly in New Jersey before I moved to Harbor Ridge. Different times back then, but Mary was remarkable, passionate about education, kind to everyone." "We were discussing how Harbor Ridge has changed," Rebecca explained. "Mrs. Reynolds has lived here 60 years. "Seen it rise and fall," Martha Reynolds agreed. "The harbor used to be so full of boats, you could practically walk across it stepping from deck to deck. Now look at it." Everyone turned toward the window. Outside, the marina held only a handful of working vessels among the weekend sailboats and small pleasure craft. "This place was the heart of the town," Martha continued. "Your mother understood that, Eleanor. This restaurant was meant to welcome everyone. Fishermen, tourists, doesn't matter. That's what made it special." Eleanor felt something twist inside her chest. Her mother had opened the restaurant as Wilson's Harbor Kitchen nearly 40 years ago. After her parents passed, Eleanor had renamed it, but tried to maintain its spirit. Until yesterday. As the afternoon stretched on, Eleanor excused herself and retreated to the kitchen, Martha's words echoing in her mind. By closing time, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. They had served more meals in 2 days than they typically did in 2 weeks. The register was full, the tip jar overflowing. But as Eleanor counted the day's earnings, she felt no satisfaction. Success built on Meryl Streep's grace felt unearned, almost fraudulent. After Sophie and Jamie left, Eleanor sat alone at the counter, staring at her reflection in the darkened window. Harbor Ridge's lights twinkled behind her. More were lit. Tonight than usual, other businesses staying open late to catch the overflow from her restaurant. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. "Eleanor's Harbor Kitchen," she answered automatically. "Eleanor, it's David from the Chamber of Commerce. Have you seen the news?" She hadn't. David directed her to check online, where Harbor Ridge was trending. Articles with headlines like "Small, Coastal Town Gets Street Boost" and "How Meryl Streep Saved a Struggling Restaurant" populated her search results. Saved. The word stung. Eleanor had always prided herself on self-sufficiency, on never needing to be saved by anyone. Yet here she was, benefiting from the kindness of a woman she had turned away. As she locked up and walked to her car, Eleanor noticed lights on at Coastal Books, the bookstore that had been struggling for years. Through the window she saw customers, browsing shelves. Further down, the art gallery was open late, visitors examining local paintings. The tide was changing in Harbor Ridge. And Eleanor Wilson was beginning to realize she had a choice. She could resist it, clinging to pride and old certainties, or she could learn from Meryl Streep's example of grace. By the time she reached home, Eleanor knew what she needed to do. It wouldn't be easy. The words "I'm sorry" had never come naturally to her, but it was necessary. Tomorrow she would write a letter, the first step toward making things right. The pale morning light filtered through Eleanor's kitchen window as she sat at her small oak table, a blank piece of stationery before her. She had risen before dawn, made a pot of strong coffee, and sat down to write her letter to Meryl Streep. But the words wouldn't come. How do you apologize to someone whose kindness you didn't deserve? Eleanor tapped her pen against the paper, leaving tiny blue dots in the corner. She had rehearsed what to say all night, but now faced with the actual task, she felt inadequate. She thought back to her father's lessons about owning your mistakes. "Apologize with your whole heart, or don't bother at all," he would say, whenever. She tried to offer half-hearted regrets as a child. Eleanor took a deep breath and began to write. "Dear Miss Streep," she wrote, her normally confident handwriting slightly unsteady. "I owe you an apology. What I did was wrong." She paused, then continued with growing certainty. "I allowed my personal opinions to override the core values of..." hospitality and respect that my parents instilled in me and that this restaurant was built upon. I made a judgment I had no right to make, and I treated you poorly when you had done nothing to deserve it." The words came easier now, flowing from a place of honesty Eleanor hadn't accessed in some time. "Your response to my behavior has humbled me deeply. Instead of anger or retaliation, you showed generosity of spirit that I never expected. You've reminded me what it means to truly live by one's principles, something I thought I was doing, but clearly wasn't." Eleanor finished the letter, reading it over twice before slipping it into an envelope. She didn't have Meryl Streep's address, but perhaps Sophie could help with that. Her daughter seemed to know how these things worked better than she did. The restaurant, the morning preparations were already underway when Eleanor arrived. Sophie had come in early again, and Martha was there too, kneading dough for the day's bread. "You look terrible," Martha commented, not unkindly. "Did you sleep at all?" Eleanor shook her head, holding up the envelope. "I wrote to her, to Meryl Streep." Sophie looked up from where she was arranging flowers on the counter. "You did?" Eleanor nodded. "But I don't know how to get it to her." Sophie smiled, drying her hands on a towel. "I might be able to help with that. Jamie's cousin works as a production assistant on film sets. She might know someone who knows someone." "Is that how these things work?" Eleanor asked skeptically. "Sometimes," Sophie replied. "Let me see what I can do." The restaurant opened at 11, and once again customers streamed in steadily. This time, Eleanor forced herself to work the front, facing the curious stares and occasional whispered comments with as much dignity as she could muster. Around 1 o'clock, Rebecca Chen returned, sitting at the counter with her notebook. Eleanor approached her cautiously. "Ms. Chen," she acknowledged. "The restaurant's doing well," Rebecca observed, glancing around at the full tables. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, then hesitated before adding, "thanks to Meryl Streep." Rebecca studied her, thoughtfully. "You know, I've been talking to people around town. Everyone says you're stubborn, principled, hard-working, but fair. What happened with Ms. Streep seems out of character." Eleanor was silent for a moment, wiping the counter with slow, deliberate strokes. "Sometimes we fall short of who we think we are," she said finally. "I'm trying to make it right." Rebecca nodded, jotting something in her notebook. "May I ask how?" "I've written her a letter, an apology. Would you be willing to share what you wrote?" Eleanor shook her head firmly. "That's between her and me." Despite her refusal, Eleanor found herself continuing to talk with Rebecca throughout the afternoon. The journalist asked about the restaurant's history, about Harbour Ridge's decline, about Eleanor's parents and their vision for the place. There was something about Rebecca's quiet attentiveness that made Eleanor open up more than she'd intended. "My father was a fisherman, my mother a teacher," Eleanor explained as the lunch rush died down. "They started this place when the fishing became unreliable. Mom wanted a restaurant where everyone would feel welcome, from the fishermen coming in at dawn to the summer tourists." "And your daughter? What does Sophie want for this place?" Rebecca asked. The question caught Eleanor off guard. I'm not sure we've discussed it." Late that afternoon, a familiar figure entered the restaurant. Martha Reynolds, the elderly woman who had known Meryl's mother, made her way slowly to the counter and settled onto a stool. "Just tea, please," she requested, "and perhaps a moment of your time." Eleanor poured her tea, curious. Martha Reynolds reached into her bag and pulled out a yellowed photograph, sliding it across the counter. "Found this last night after you. All got me reminiscing," she explained. The photograph showed two young women in 1960s attire, standing in front of a school building laughing. Eleanor recognized a youthful Martha Reynolds immediately. The other woman had familiar features, unmistakably Meryl Streep's mother. "Mary loved this town," Martha said, sipping her tea. "We spent a summer here together before she married, and moved away. She always talked about coming back." "I didn't know," Eleanor murmured, studying the photograph. "There's a lot we don't know about each other," Martha said gently. "That's why we should lead with kindness, not judgment." Eleanor felt those words settled deep within her. She had judged Meryl based on a snippet of an interview, without knowing the full context, without considering the complexity of the person behind the public persona. That evening, after closing, Sophie approached Eleanor with excitement in her eyes. "I found a way," she said, holding up her phone. "Jamie's cousin connected me with someone who works for Meryl's production company. They gave me an email address where we can send a scanned copy of your letter." Eleanor stared at the envelope. In her hands, "It feels impersonal to email it." "It's better than nothing," Sophie pointed out. "And I was thinking maybe we could invite her back for dinner. Just her, not a public thing." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse. The thought of facing Meryl Streep again filled her with dread. But then she thought of Martha Reynolds's words about leading with kindness. "Yes," she said finally, "if she's willing to come, I owe her that much." Later that night, in the quiet of her home, Eleanor scanned the letter and watched as Sophie sent it to the email address they'd been given. The action felt both terrifying and liberating. "Do you think she'll respond?" Sophie asked softly. "I don't know," Eleanor admitted, "but either way, it was the right thing to do." As Eleanor lay in bed that night, she found herself thinking of her parents, how they had built the restaurant as a place of welcome, how disappointed they would have been by her behavior toward Meryl Streep. For the first time in years, she felt herself truly reconnecting with the values they had instilled in her. Outside her window, the moon cast silver light across Harbour Ridge. The town seemed different somehow, more alive than it had been in years. And though Eleanor knew much of that was due to Meryl Streep's unexpected kindness, she also sensed something else stirring, a reawakening of Harbour Ridge's spirit, and perhaps her own as well. Tomorrow would bring uncertainty. Would Meryl read her letter? Would she accept the apology? Would she consider returning to the restaurant that had once turned her away? Eleanor didn't know. But she had taken the first step toward making amends, and for now, that would have to be enough. 3. Days passed with no response from Meryl Streep. Eleanor tried to focus on the restaurant, which continued to bustle with activity, but her eyes drifted to the door whenever the bell chimed. Sophie checked her email obsessively, refreshing the screen every few minutes when she wasn't serving customers. "Maybe she didn't get it," Sophie suggested on the evening of the third day as they closed up. "Or maybe her people filter her messages." Eleanor nodded, wiping down tables with more force than necessary. "It doesn't matter," she said, though they both knew it did. Meanwhile, in a rented cottage 20 miles up the coast, Meryl Streep sat in a worn leather armchair, reading Eleanor's letter for the third time. The filming schedule had been intense, leaving her little time to respond to personal correspondence. But this letter had caught her attention. Its honesty, its vulnerability, its complete lack of excuses. Meryl set the letter down and gazed out the window at the darkening coastline. She thought about Harbour Ridge, about Eleanor's restaurant with its view of fishing boats and its walls lined with local history. She thought about her mother, who had once spent a summer there and spoken of it fondly. She picked up her phone, hand-dialed her assistant. "Sarah, can you clear Friday evening for me? There's somewhere I need to be." The following morning, Sophie burst into the kitchen where Eleanor was preparing clam chowder, her face flushed with excitement. "She responded," Sophie exclaimed, holding up her phone. "Meryl's assistant emailed me. She read your letter and accepts your invitation. She's coming Friday." Eleanor nearly dropped her spoon. Despite having extended the invitation, some part of her hadn't truly believed Meryl would accept. Now that she had, Eleanor felt a rush of anxiety. Friday, that's tomorrow. Her assistant says she wants it to be private, just her after closing. No press, no other guests. Eleanor nodded, understanding. This wasn't meant to be a spectacle or a publicity stunt. It was to be a real conversation between two people. That afternoon, Eleanor found herself planning the menu with uncharacteristic indecision. What do you serve to a woman you've wronged, who then showed you kindness you didn't deserve? "Your seafood pot pie," Martha suggested when Eleanor called her in a panic. "It's your best dish and it's honest food. Nothing pretentious." Eleanor agreed. She would make her seafood pot pie, her mother's recipe, with local fish and shellfish, in a rich cream sauce topped with buttery pastry. For dessert, blueberry cobbler with hand-whipped cream. Simple food made with care and integrity. Friday arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze off the water. The restaurant was busier than ever, but Eleanor moved through the day in a daze, her mind fixed on the evening ahead. Rebecca Chen appeared at lunchtime, settling at her now usual spot at the counter. "Big night tonight," she commented. Eleanor looked up sharply. "How did you—" "I'm a journalist," Rebecca reminded her with a small smile. "But don't worry, I respect Ms. Streep's request for privacy. No article about tonight." Eleanor relaxed slightly. "Thank you. But," Rebecca continued, "I would like to talk to you afterward if you're willing. Not about what was said. That's private, but about what it meant to you. This whole experience has been transformative for Harbour Ridge." Eleanor considered this. "We'll see," she said finally, neither committing nor refusing. As closing time approached, Eleanor sent Sophie home to change and rest before returning for dinner. She wanted her daughter there. Sophie's warmth would balance Eleanor's more reserved nature, but she also wanted time alone to prepare the restaurant. Eleanor moved through the space with deliberate care, selecting her mother's best tablecloth, polishing the silverware until it gleamed, arranging fresh wildflowers in a simple glass vase. She chose a table by the window, where the view of the harbour at sunset would be most beautiful. In the kitchen, she prepared the pot pie with methodical precision, her hands steady despite her nerves. The familiar routine of chopping, stirring and rolling pastry soothed her, connecting her to generations of Wilson women who had expressed care through food. At 7:45, Sophie returned wearing a simple blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders. "You look lovely," Eleanor said, feeling suddenly old and tired in her chef's apron. "So do you," Sophie insisted, helping her mother change into a fresh blouse. "You look like yourself, strong, capable, and ready to make things right." At precisely 8, a car pulled into the empty parking lot. Eleanor and Sophie watched through the window as Meryl Streep emerged, dressed simply in slacks and a light sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. No entourage, no security detail, just her. Eleanor took a deep breath and walked to the door, opening it before Meryl could knock. "Miss Streep," she greeted, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for coming." "Meryl, please," came the warm response as she stepped inside. "And thank you for the invitation." There was an awkward moment as they stood in the entryway, the weight of their previous encounter hanging between them. Then Sophie stepped forward, breaking the tension. "It's an honor to meet you," she said sincerely. "I'm Sophie, Eleanor's daughter." Meryl smiled, the famous warmth that had charmed audiences for decades now directed at Sophie. "The pleasure is mine. Your mother speaks highly of you in her letter." They moved to the prepared table, Eleanor serving wine as Sophie brought out fresh bread and a simple salad to start. The conversation began tentatively, comments about the weather, the view, the recent filming in the area, but gradually eased into something more natural. "This is a beautiful town," Meryl observed, looking out at the harbour where lights from the boats twinkled against the darkening sky. "It reminds me of places from my childhood." "I understand your mother spent time here," Eleanor said carefully. Meryl looked surprised. "Yes, she did. How did you know?" Eleanor explained about Martha Reynolds and the photograph, watching as Meryl's expression softened with memory. "Mom loved it here," Meryl confirmed. "She talked about Harbour Ridge often, the people, the harbour, the sense of community. She would have loved your restaurant." The main course arrived, the seafood pot pie golden and fragrant. Meryl took a bite and closed her eyes briefly in appreciation. "This is extraordinary," she said. "Family recipe?" Eleanor nodded. "My mother's. She believed food should be honest, no pretense, just good ingredients treated with respect." "A wise philosophy," Meryl replied, "for cooking and for life." The conversation deepened as they ate. Eleanor found herself talking about the restaurant's history, her parents' dream, the challenges of keeping it going as Harbour Ridge's economy declined. Meryl listened attentively, asking thoughtful questions. When there was a natural pause, Eleanor set down her fork and met Meryl's gaze directly. "I want to apologize again in person," she said, her voice low but firm. "What I did was inexcusable. I judged you based on a single interview, without context, without consideration for the complexity behind anyone's views. That's not who I want to be." Meryl was quiet for a moment. We all fall short of our ideals sometimes, she said finally. What matters is what we do afterward. Why did you post about the restaurant? Eleanor asked, the question that had been haunting her for days. After how I treated you. Meryl considered her answer carefully. I've been in the public eye for a long time, she said. I've seen how quickly conflicts escalate, how easy it is for misunderstandings to harden into permanent divisions. I wanted something different. As blueberry cobbler was served, the conversation turned to Harbour Ridge's challenges, the declining fishing industry, young people leaving, businesses struggling to stay afloat. This town has so much potential, Meryl C. observed. It just needs a spark, a reason for people to rediscover it. By the time coffee was poured, the initial awkwardness had disappeared entirely. They spoke as if they were old acquaintances catching up, rather than strangers brought together by conflict and reconciliation. As the evening drew to a close, Meryl reached into her bag and pulled out a book, a collection of New England coastal recipes. This was my mother's, she said, sliding it across the table to Eleanor. I think she would want you to have it. Some of her notes are in the margins. Eleanor accepted the book with trembling hands, understanding the significance of the gesture. Thank you, she whispered. I'll treasure it. They walked together to the door, the evening having built a bridge neither had expected to cross. As they said their goodbyes, Meryl paused. I have a foundation that supports small-town revitalization, she said casually. Particularly places with strong cultural heritage. Would you mind if I had someone reach out to the Harbour Ridge Chamber of Commerce? Eleanor stared at her, speechless. For a moment, then found her voice. That would be remarkable, Meryl smiled. Consider it done. As her car pulled away, Eleanor and Sophie stood in the doorway watching until the taillights disappeared around the bend. Well, Sophie asked softly. Eleanor held Mary Streep's cookbook against her chest, feeling something like hope unfurling within her. I think, she said slowly, this is just the beginning. The morning after Meryl's visit, Eleanor woke with a sense of lightness she hadn't felt in years. The weight of regret that had settled on her shoulders days ago had lifted, replaced by something that felt remarkably like hope. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, paging through Mary Streep's cookbook, running her fingers over the handwritten notes in the margins. Add more thyme, one note read, beside a chowder recipe. Double the butter. Life is short, advised another. Eleanor smiled, feeling a connection to a woman she had never met but whose daughter had shown her extraordinary grace. At the restaurant, Sophie was already bustling about when Eleanor arrived, her face bright with excitement. Have you checked your email? Sophie asked immediately. Eleanor shook her head. Technology had never been her strong suit. Meryl's foundation already reached out to David at the Chamber of Commerce, Sophie explained. They're sending a representative next week to discuss revitalization opportunities for Harbour Ridge. The news spread through town like wildfire. By lunchtime, Eleanor's phone was ringing constantly with calls from fellow business owners, town officials, and curious neighbors. Is it true? Asked Margaret from Coastal Books. Is Meryl Streep really helping Harbour Ridge? Not just Meryl, Eleanor found herself saying. All of us, together. The restaurant was bustling again, but there was a different energy now. Instead of mere curiosity seekers, many customers were locals who hadn't dined at Eleanor's in years. They came with congratulations, suggestions, and reminiscences about Harbour Ridge's better days. Late that afternoon, Rebecca Chen appeared as usual, settling at the counter with her notebook. I hear things went well last night, she commented. Eleanor nodded, pouring Rebecca's usual coffee. It was illuminating. Care to elaborate? Rebecca asked, pen poised. Eleanor considered for a moment. You know the bridge at the north end of town? The old one that connects Harbour Ridge to Oakmont? Rebecca nodded. For years that bridge was in disrepair. People avoided it, took the long way around. Then the town finally restored it, and suddenly the two communities were connected again. Eleanor paused. Last night felt like rebuilding. A bridge? Rebecca smiled, jotting down the analogy. And where does that bridge lead? I'm not entirely sure, Eleanor admitted, but somewhere good, I think. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor found herself at the center of a transformation she could never have predicted. Representatives from the Streep Foundation arrived, not publicists or celebrities, but serious professionals with expertise in economic development, historic preservation, and community revitalization. They met at the town hall, a building that hadn't seen such a crowd in decades. Business owners, town officials, and concerned citizens packed the space, all eager to hear how Meryl Streep might save their struggling community. Jennifer Layton, the foundation's director, stood at the podium, her manner direct but kind. "Ms. Streep's interest brought us here," she acknowledged, "but your commitment will keep us here. We don't swoop in and save towns. We partner with communities that are ready to save themselves." A murmur ran through the crowd. This wasn't the instant solution some had hoped for. "Our foundation provides matching grants, expertise, and connections," Jennifer continued. "But the vision, the work, the heart, that has to come from all of you." Eleanor sat between Sophie and Martha, listening intently. As Jennifer outlined the foundation's approach, focusing on sustainable development that honored a town's unique character and history, Eleanor felt something stirring within her, not just hope now, but purpose. When the meeting opened for questions, Eleanor surprised herself by standing. "Harbour Ridge isn't just old buildings and a pretty view," she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It's generations of families who built something meaningful here. Whatever we do next needs to honor that history while creating a future our children might actually want to be part of." The room fell silent, then erupted in applause. Jennifer Layton nodded appreciatively. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we're looking for," she said. "Who are you?" "Eleanor Wilson. I own the restaurant by the harbour." Jennifer's eyes lit with recognition. "Ah, Eleanor. Miss Streep mentioned you specifically. She suggested your restaurant might serve as a central gathering place for community planning sessions." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "She did?" The next morning, a tall, weathered man with sun-creased eyes and calloused hands appeared at Eleanor's. Just as she was opening, Jackson Barnes, Harbour Ridge's most respected fisherman, carried a cooler of fresh catch. "Heard you might be needing more seafood," he said gruffly. With all these new customers, Eleanor accepted the cooler, noticing the quality of the fish inside, better than what her supplier had been providing. "How much do I owe you?" she asked. Jackson shook his head. "Consider it an investment. You showcase my catch. I'll keep bringing the best I have." As he turned to leave, he added, "That cookbook of Mary Streep's, her notes any good?" Eleanor looked up in surprise. "You knew her?" "Everyone my age knew Mary," he said simply. "She loved this town almost as much as we did." Over the following week, Eleanor's harbour kitchen became more than just a restaurant. In the afternoons between lunch and dinner, the tables were pushed together for community meetings. Plans were sketched on paper napkins. Debates about Harbour Ridge's future unfolded over Eleanor's coffee and homemade muffins. Sophie thrived in this new environment, moving confidently among the various groups, offering suggestions that bridged generational divides. She proposed a series of community dinners, featuring local seafood and produce, with proceeds supporting the restoration of the harbour's historic lighthouse. "We could call it Taste of Harbour Ridge," Sophie suggested during one planning session. Each dinner could highlight a different aspect of our town's history. Eleanor watched her daughter with quiet pride. Sophie had always been capable, but now she was blossoming into a leader. One evening after closing, Eleanor found Sophie studying Mary Streep's cookbook, copying down notes. "I was thinking," Sophie said without looking up, "we could incorporate some of these recipes into our community dinners, with credit to Mary, of course." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "I think she would have liked that." "And Mom," Sophie continued, hesitation in her voice, "I've been wondering if we should consider updating our menu. Not changing everything, but adding some new options, maybe some lighter fare for lunch." In the past, Eleanor might have dismissed such suggestions outright. The menu had remained largely unchanged for years, a point of pride for her. But the events of the past week had shifted something fundamental in her approach. "What did you have in mind?" she asked instead. Sophie's eyes widened in surprise, then crinkled with delight as she pulled out a notebook filled with ideas. As they discussed possibilities, Eleanor realized how much her daughter had been holding back, respecting Eleanor's traditional approach while quietly developing her own culinary vision. Meanwhile, other changes were unfolding throughout Harbour Ridge. The bookstore extended its hours and added a coffee corner using Eleanor's blend. The art gallery organized an exhibition featuring local scenes attracting visitors from neighboring towns. Even the old cannery building, abandoned for decades, was being evaluated for potential renovation as a maritime museum and marketplace. At the heart of it all was Eleanor's harbour kitchen, buzzing with new energy while maintaining its core identity. Eleanor found herself adapting to changes she would have resisted fiercely just weeks ago, discovering that flexibility didn't have to mean losing what mattered most. One quiet morning before opening, Eleanor stood at the window, watching Jackson's fishing boat return to harbour. The sun glinted off the water, casting the town in a golden light that seemed to reveal Harbour Ridge not just as it was, but as it could be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Just heard from Meryl's assistant. She's been following our progress and sends her best wishes. Says she might stop by next time she's filming in the area." Eleanor smiled, tucking the phone away. The bridge to understanding they had built that night over seafood pot pie was extending now, connecting past to future, tradition to innovation, wariness to welcome. Outside, Harbour Ridge awakened to possibilities it had forgotten existed. And, inside Eleanor's harbour kitchen, new beginnings were taking root with every meal served, every gathering hosted, every bridge rebuilt. 3 weeks after Meryl Streep's visit, the initial euphoria in Harbour Ridge began to give way to the more challenging reality of meaningful change. Eleanor stood in her kitchen at 5:30 a.m., staring at a disaster of overflowing prep containers, dwindling supplies, and a walk-in cooler that couldn't possibly hold the additional seafood Jackson would be delivering in 2 hours. "We need more space," she muttered to herself, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. The restaurant had never been this busy for this long, and their systems, designed for a quiet local establishment, were buckling under the pressure. The bell above the door jingled as Sophie entered, carrying a tray of coffees from the new cafe that had opened down the street. "Thought we could use reinforcements," she said, setting a cup beside Eleanor. "I saw the light on, couldn't sleep either." Eleanor shook her head. "We've got 30 reservations for breakfast, 65 for lunch, and we're hosting that foundation meeting at 3. I don't know how we're going to manage." Sophie took a sip of her coffee, surveying the kitchen with a critical eye. "We need help, Mom, professional help." "We can't afford a consultant," Eleanor said firmly. "Actually, we can," Sophie countered, pulling out the ledger. "Look at our numbers for the past 3 weeks." Eleanor studied the figures, her eyebrows rising. The restaurant had made more in 3 weeks than it normally did in 3 months, and that's with our current limitations, Sophie pointed out. "Think what we could do if we were actually prepared for this level of business." When Sophie had first suggested bringing in a restaurant consultant, Eleanor had dismissed the idea immediately. But now, faced with the undeniable evidence of their success and their struggle to maintain it, she found herself reconsidering. "Who did you have in mind?" she asked finally. Sophie grinned. "I might have already made a call." Later that morning, amid the breakfast rush, a petite woman with silver-streaked black hair and sharp eyes walked into Eleanor's harbour kitchen. She observed the busy dining room with a practiced gaze, noting the bottleneck at the service station, the overwhelmed buses, the tickets piling up at the kitchen window. "Miss Wilson." She approached Eleanor, who was expediting orders while simultaneously refilling coffee cups. "I'm Diane Lee, your daughter called me." Eleanor looked up, flustered. "This isn't a good time." "On the contrary," Diane replied calmly. "This is exactly the time. I need to see what's not working." For the next 2 hours, Diane moved through the restaurant like a shadow, observing, taking notes, occasionally asking brief questions of the staff. Eleanor found her presence both irritating and oddly reassuring. When the breakfast rush finally subsided, Diane settled at the counter with a cup of tea and a notepad filled with observations. "You have a good foundation," she began without preamble. "Quality food, loyal customers, dedicated staff, but your systems were designed for a different level of business." Eleanor sighed, pouring herself a much-needed coffee. "Tell me something." "I don't know." "You need a complete redesign of your kitchen workflow, an additional prep station, a computerized ordering system, and at least 2 more staff members," Diane stated matter-of-factly. "And that's just for starters." Eleanor felt a familiar resistance rising within her. The kitchen had been arranged this way since her mother's time. The handwritten ordering system had worked perfectly well for decades. Change for the sake of change seemed unnecessary and disrespectful to tradition. "We've managed fine for 30 years, she said stiffly. Diane's expression softened slightly. "Ms. Wilson, Eleanor, your restaurant isn't the same as it was 30 years ago. It's evolving into something new, something more. The question is whether you'll evolve with it or fight it every step of the way." Before Eleanor could respond, Sophie approached with Jackson Barnes, who had arrived with his daily delivery of fresh fish. The weathered fisherman nodded respectfully at Eleanor. "Got some beautiful halibut today," he said. "And I brought those." "Scallops you asked about, Sophie." Eleanor frowned. "Scallops? We don't serve scallops." "Actually," Sophie interjected carefully, "I was thinking we might add them to the menu. For a special. I found a recipe in Mary Streep's cookbook. Seared scallops with a citrus butter sauce." Eleanor felt that familiar resistance again, stronger now. First a consultant telling her to change her kitchen, now her daughter changing the menu without consulting her. "We need to talk," she said to Sophie, her voice tight. "In private." In the office, little more than a closet with a desk, Eleanor confronted her daughter. "What's going on, Sophie? Consultants? Menu changes? This isn't how we do things." Sophie's expression was a mix of frustration and determination. "That's exactly the point, Mom. How we've always done things isn't working anymore. We have an opportunity here." "To what? Become something we're not? To grow into what we could be?" Sophie countered. "Harbour Ridge is changing. Our customers are changing. Why are we the only ones who have to stay exactly the same?" Eleanor fell silent, the question striking deeper than Sophie could know. At 62, Eleanor had built her identity around constancy, around being the unchanging center in a world that valued novelty over tradition. The thought of reimagining herself, her restaurant, her role in Harbour Ridge, it was terrifying. The argument might have continued, but they were interrupted by Martha, who poked her head into the office. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "But David from the Chamber of Commerce is here. He says it's important." David Jenkins, a balding man with an perpetually anxious expression, stood by the counter, fidgeting with a folder. "Eleanor," he began, "the Regional Tourism Board has been in touch. They want Harbour Ridge to participate in the Coastal Festival next month." Eleanor blinked in surprise. The Coastal Festival was a prestigious event that showcased the best of New England's maritime communities. Harbour Ridge hadn't been invited to participate in years, not since the fishing industry had declined. "That's wonderful news," Sophie exclaimed. "There's more," David continued. "They specifically requested that Eleanor's Harbour Kitchen represent our town as the food vendor. They've heard about your revival, about the Meryl Streep connection, about your use of local seafood. They think you could be the centerpiece of our presentation." Eleanor felt the room spin slightly. Being invited to the festival was an honor, but also an enormous responsibility. Thousands of visitors, food critics, potential investors, all watching, judging, expecting excellence. I'm not sure we're ready for that," she stammered. "We have 6 weeks to prepare," David said. "The foundation has offered to help with funding for equipment, booth setup, whatever you need." As David laid out the details, Eleanor felt increasingly overwhelmed. Her small traditional restaurant was being thrust into a spotlight she had never sought. She glanced around at the faces watching her expectantly, Sophie's excitement, Martha's quiet pride, Jackson's steady confidence, Diane's professional assessment, and felt the weight of their expectations. "I need some air," she said abruptly, heading for the door. Outside, Eleanor walked to the edge of the harbour, her breathing rapid and shallow. The water lapped gently against the dock as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. Footsteps approached. Behind her, Martha stood beside her, offering silent companionship as they watched a fishing boat make its way into the harbour. "It's a lot," Martha said finally. Eleanor nodded, words stuck in her throat. "You know what your mother would say," Martha continued. She'd say, "Eleanor James Wilson, since when do you run from a challenge?" Despite herself, Eleanor smiled. That was exactly what her mother would say in exactly that tone. "I'm not running," she protested weakly. "I'm just afraid," Martha finished for her. "We all are. Change is terrifying, especially when you've worked so hard to keep things the same." Eleanor sighed, watching the fishing boat dock with practiced precision. "What if I can't be what they all want me to be?" Martha's gaze was steady and kind. "No one's asking you to be someone new, Ellie. They're just asking you to be more fully who you already are. Someone who cares deeply about this town, about good food, about bringing people together." As they stood in comfortable silence, Eleanor thought about Meryl Streep's unexpected grace, about Mary Streep's cookbook with its adventurous margin notes, about Sophie's eager innovation balanced with respect for tradition. Perhaps change didn't have to mean abandonment of the past, but rather its thoughtful evolution. With a deep breath, Eleanor turned back toward the restaurant, ready to face the challenges ahead, not fearlessly perhaps, but with a growing determination to navigate these growing pains with the same resilience that had sustained her through far worse storms. 6 months after Meryl Streep was denied service at Eleanor's Harbour kitchen, Harbour Ridge had transformed in ways that even the most optimistic residents couldn't have predicted. On a crisp autumn morning, Eleanor stood on the newly restored harbour boardwalk, watching the sunrise paint the sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. The harbour, once dotted with only a handful of aging vessels, now bustled with activity, fishing, boats, pleasure craft, and even a small tour boat that offered harbour cruises to weekend visitors. Eleanor marvelled at how much had changed, and how much of that change traced back to a single moment of grace. After her initial panic about the coastal festival had subsided, Eleanor had faced her fears head-on. With Sophie by her side and Diane Lee's expert guidance, they had reimagined the restaurant's kitchen, streamlined their processes, and expanded their menu, all while maintaining the core identity that made Eleanor's Harbour kitchen special. Their booth at the Coastal Festival had been a resounding success. Eleanor's seafood pot pie, now featuring Jackson's premium catch, had won the festival's Best Traditional Dish award. But it was Sophie's innovation, seared scallops with citrus butter sauce, inspired by Mary Streep's cookbook, that had truly captured attention, earning rave reviews from food critics and visitors alike. The publicity from the festival had brought a new wave of visitors to Harbour Ridge. But unlike the initial curious crowds who came for the Meryl Streep connection, these visitors came for the food, the charm, and the authenticity of a town rediscovering its identity. Eleanor's reverie was interrupted by Rebecca Chen, who joined her at the railing. "Beautiful morning," Rebecca commented, sipping from a travel mug emblazoned with the logo of Harbour Ridge's new coffee shop. "It is," Eleanor agreed. Rebecca had remained in Harbour Ridge far longer than her original assignment required, captivated by the town's evolving story. Her series of articles for the Atlantic Coast had chronicled Harbour Ridge's revival, earning her a regional journalism award and bringing even more attention to the small coastal community. "I'm finishing my piece on the lighthouse restoration today," Rebecca said. "Any quote you'd like to add? You were one of the major donors, after all." Eleanor smiled, thinking of the lighthouse that had stood sentinel over Harbour Ridge for generations. Its restoration had been a community-wide effort, funded in part by proceeds from the Taste of Harbour Ridge dinner series that Sophie had proposed months ago. "Just that some things are worth preserving," Eleanor replied, "and sometimes it takes new energy to save what matters most from the past." As they walked back toward town, Eleanor marveled at the changes visible on every street. Storefronts that had been empty for years now housed new businesses, an artisanal bakery, a maritime bookstore, a gallery showcasing local artists. The old cannery building was midway through its transformation into a maritime museum and marketplace, with a projected opening date in the spring. But the heart of Harbour Ridge's revival remained Eleanor's Harbour kitchen. True to Meryl's suggestion, the restaurant had become a community gathering place. Eleanor had initially resisted Diane and Sophie's proposal to adjust the restaurant's hours to accommodate community events, but she now counted it among her best decisions. Back at the restaurant, preparations for the day were already underway. The kitchen, now expanded and modernized, hummed with efficient activity. Two new chefs, both recent culinary school graduates who had grown up in Harbour Ridge, worked alongside Eleanor, learning her traditional recipes while contributing fresh ideas. Sophie was in the dining room arranging tables for a special event that afternoon, a cooking class for local children. Inspired by Mary Streep's cookbook, Sophie had started a monthly series teaching kids about local ingredients and traditional cooking methods. The classes had proven so popular that they now had a waiting list. The magazine photographer is coming. At 10, Sophie reminded Eleanor as she entered. For the feature on New England's culinary revivals. Eleanor nodded, still somewhat amazed that her modest restaurant would be highlighted in a national publication. She checked her watch and headed to the kitchen to begin preparing for the day's service. At noon, the restaurant opened for lunch, filling quickly with a mix of locals and visitors. Eleanor moved between the kitchen and dining room, greeting regular customers by name and welcoming newcomers with the same warmth. She had discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she enjoyed this more public role, connecting with people, sharing stories, being the face of a restaurant that now represented something larger than herself. After the lunch service, chairs were rearranged for the afternoon's cooking class. 20 children ages 8 to 12 filed in excitedly, donning miniature aprons embroidered with Harbour Ridge Junior Chefs. "Today, we're making fish chowder," Sophie announced, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Using a recipe that's been made in Harbour Ridge for over 100 years, Eleanor watched from the doorway as Sophie guided the children through measuring ingredients, explaining techniques, and sharing the history behind the dish. Her daughter had blossomed these past months, growing into a community leader with a vision that honored tradition while embracing change. Among the parents watching from the sidelines was Martha Reynolds, now a regular presence at these events despite her advancing age. At 92, she remained a vital link to Harbour Ridge's past and an enthusiastic supporter of its future. "Mary, they would be so proud," Martha commented as Eleanor brought her a cup of tea. Of all of this, Eleanor nodded, thinking of the cookbook that had become something of a talisman for her and Sophie. Many of its recipes, adapted and updated, now featured on their menu. Mary Streep's margin notes had inspired not just new dishes, but a philosophy that balanced innovation with respect for tradition. Later that afternoon, as the children departed with containers of chowder to share with their families, Eleanor found herself alone in the restaurant for a rare, quiet moment. She sat at a window table, the same one where she had shared that transformative dinner with Meryl Streep, and looked out at the harbour. A gentle knock at the door interrupted her reflection. Jackson Barnes stood outside, holding a wooden crate. Eleanor let him in, curious. "Found these while cleaning out my father's boathouse," Jackson explained, setting down the crate. "Inside were old photographs, ledgers, and nautical charts. Thought they might be of interest for your wall." Eleanor sifted through the materials, pausing at a faded photograph showing the harbour in the 1960s. Among the crowd gathered for what appeared to be a harbour festival was a familiar face, a young woman with a warm smile who bore a striking resemblance to Meryl Streep. "Is that—" Eleanor began. Jackson nodded. "Mary Streep. My father knew her well. She loved this town." Eleanor studied the photograph, a piece of the puzzle falling into place. Mary Streep's connection to Harbour Ridge had been deeper than she'd realized. No wonder Meryl had responded with such grace to Eleanor's rejection. Harbour Ridge wasn't just any town to her. It was part of her family's story too. That evening, after closing, the restaurant hosted another community gathering, this one for business owners and town officials to discuss plans for Harbour Ridge's winter festival. As ideas flowed and conversation buzzed around her, Eleanor felt a profound sense of gratitude. 6 months ago, she had stood firm in judgment, closing her door to someone based on a difference of opinion. That moment could have defined her, could have defined Harbour Ridge as small-minded and unwelcoming. Instead, thanks to Meryl Streep's unexpected grace, it had become the catalyst for opening doors throughout the community. As Eleanor looked around at the vibrant group assembled in her restaurant, Sophie's confident leadership, Martha's living wisdom, Jackson's steady presence, Rebecca's thoughtful observations, and dozens of others now connected in purpose, She understood that the true transformation wasn't in the renovated buildings or increased tourism. The true transformation was in the community itself, in the connections rebuilt and strengthened, in the bridges that now spanned differences of age, background, and perspective. And it had all begun with one simple choice: responding to rejection not with anger, but with kindness that created space for change. The morning of Harbour Ridge's inaugural Winter Food Festival arrived with perfect New England weather. Crisp, clear and cold enough for breath to form visible clouds, but sunny enough to draw people outdoors. Eleanor stood at the restaurant's window, watching as volunteers placed the final decorations along Main Street. Twinkling lights crisscrossed above the road, evergreen garlands adorned lampposts, and hand-painted banners welcomed visitors to what the town hoped would become an annual tradition. "Nervous?" Sophie asked, joining her mother at the window. Eleanor nodded. "A little. It's been a long time since I participated in a cooking demonstration in front of an audience." "You'll be wonderful," Sophie assured her. "Besides, you're not doing it alone." That was true. The festival's main event was a special cooking demonstration featuring Eleanor and 3 guest chefs from neighboring coastal towns. Together, they would prepare a multi-course meal, highlighting traditional New England winter cuisine with modern twists. What Eleanor hadn't told Sophie, or anyone else, was that she had received a message from Meryl Streep's assistant 2 days earlier. Meryl had finished filming her latest project and would be making an unannounced visit to the festival. The thought of seeing her again after all that had transpired filled Eleanor with a curious mixture of anticipation and anxiety. By 10 o'clock, Harbour Ridge was bustling with activity. Food stalls lined the streets, offering everything from Jackson's famous clam chowder to Martha Reynolds' traditional apple cider donuts. The old cannery building, partially renovated and open to the public for the first time, housed an exhibition on the town's maritime culinary history. Eleanor's harbour kitchen was serving as festival headquarters, with the dining room transformed into an information centre, and the kitchen hosting smaller cooking demonstrations throughout the morning. Eleanor moved through the crowds, greeting visitors and directing volunteers with a confidence that still sometimes surprised her. "Eleanor," David Jenkins called, hurrying toward her with his perpetually worried expression. "The film crew from New England Cuisine magazine is here early. They want to set up in the main tent before the demonstration." "I'll take care of it," Sophie offered, giving her mother's arm a squeeze before heading off with David. Eleanor checked her watch. 3 hours until the main demonstration. 3 hours until Meryl Streep might appear in Harbour Ridge again. She took a deep breath and continued her rounds, stopping to chat with Martha Reynolds, who was overseeing a table displaying historic community cookbooks, including a special exhibit centered around Mary Streep's cookbook and its connection to Harbour Ridge. "Quite a day," Martha commented, her eyes bright despite her frail frame. "Mary would have loved this." "I think about that often," Eleanor admitted. "How much she influenced all of this without ever knowing she would." Martha's gaze turned thoughtful. "Life has a way of connecting threads we never expected to intersect. You turned away Meryl Streep, and instead of ending a story, you began one." Before Eleanor could respond, a commotion near the harbour caught their attention. A small crowd had gathered, cameras flashing. Eleanor's heart raced as she made her way toward the scene, weaving through festival-goers with a mixture of determination and trepidation. And there she was, Meryl Streep, dressed simply in a woolen coat and scarf, her smile warm as she greeted people with genuine interest. Despite attempts to keep her arrival low-key, word had spread quickly through the small town. When Meryl spotted Eleanor approaching, she excused herself from the group and moved to meet her halfway. "Eleanor," she greeted warmly, as if they were old friends. "This is remarkable." Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. The last time they had stood face to face on Harbour Ridge's streets, she had turned this woman away from her restaurant. Now they stood as unlikely partners in the town's revival. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor managed, extending her hand. Meryl took it in both of hers. "I wouldn't have missed it." They walked together toward the harbour, where the main demonstration tent had been erected. Curious onlookers kept a respectful distance, allowing them a moment of semi-privacy. "Your foundation has done incredible work here," Eleanor said. "The foundation provided resources," Meryl corrected gently. You and this community did the real work. I've been following your progress through Jennifer. The cooking classes for children, the community dinners, the lighthouse restoration. It's everything we hope for when we invest in a town. They paused at the edge of the harbor, looking out at the water where boats decorated with festival flags gently rocked in the winter sunshine. I found something I thought you might want to see, Eleanor said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out the photograph Jackson had discovered, the one showing Mary Streep at the Harbour Festival decades earlier. Meryl took the photograph with careful hands, her expression softening as she studied her mother's young face. Where did you find this? Jackson Barnes, one of our local fishermen, found it in his father's things. There are others too. Apparently your mother made quite an impression here. She always spoke fondly of Harbour Ridge, Meryl said, still gazing at the photograph. She called it her road not taken. I never fully understood what she meant until now. As they continued toward the festival tent, Meryl asked about Mary's cookbook and how it had influenced the restaurant. Eleanor found herself sharing stories about the recipes they'd adapted, the margin notes that had made her laugh, the connection she'd felt to a woman she'd never met. I'd like to see what you've done with her recipes, Meryl said as they reached the tent. Actually, Eleanor replied with a small smile, you're about to. The demonstration features 3 dishes inspired by your mother's cookbook. Inside the tent, preparation for the event was well underway. Sophie looked up from where she was arranging ingredients and froze momentarily when she spotted Meryl. Then she hurried over, professional composure barely containing her excitement. Miss Streep, we had no idea you were coming. Please call me Meryl, she insisted, and I hope it's not an imposition. Not at all, Sophie assured her. In fact, she hesitated, glancing at her mother. What is it? Eleanor prompted. I was going to tell you later, but we had a last-minute cancellation. One of our guest chefs has the flu. Eleanor immediately understood the implication. Sophie, we can't ask Ms. Meryl to fill in. She's a guest. But Meryl's eyes had lit up with interest. What would I need to do? Just help prepare one dish, Sophie explained quickly. Mom's making her seafood pot pie. Chef Laurent is doing a deconstructed clam chowder, and Chef Rivera has a lobster bisque. We needed someone for the scallop dish, the one inspired by your mother's recipe. Meryl turned to Eleanor, a question in her eyes. Eleanor found herself nodding, recognizing the perfect symmetry of the moment. Where once she had denied Meryl service in her restaurant, now they would cook side by side, sharing Mary Streep's culinary legacy with the community. Word spread quickly that Meryl Streep would be participating in the demonstration. By the time the event began, the tent was packed beyond capacity, with people standing 3 deep around the edges to witness this unexpected collaboration. Eleanor introduced the chefs, saving Meryl for last. As applause thundered through the tent, Eleanor caught sight of Martha Reynolds in the front row, tears streaming unashamedly down her lined face, and Jackson Barnes standing at the back, a rare smile creasing his weathered features. The demonstration began, each chef explaining their dish and its significance to New England's culinary tradition. When it was Meryl's turn, she spoke with heartfelt emotion about her mother's love for Harbour Ridge, about the cookbook that had connected her to this community decades after her mother's passing, and about the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. Sometimes, Meryl concluded, her hands deftly preparing the scallops as she spoke, the most meaningful connections form in the most unlikely circumstances. My mother always believed that food brings people together across all boundaries. Looking around this tent at this beautiful town you've all rebuilt together, I can see she was right. As the demonstration concluded and guests lined up to sample the dishes, Eleanor stood beside Meryl, watching the community she had known all her life interact with the woman she had once turned away. The circle that had begun with a moment of rejection had completed itself in a day of shared purpose and mutual respect. Thank you, Eleanor said quietly. Meryl glanced at her questioningly. For showing me a better way, Eleanor explained. For teaching me what real grace looks like in action. Meryl smiled, squeezing Eleanor's hand briefly before turning to greet the next person in line. The festival continued around them, a celebration not just of food and tradition, but of the remarkable journey that had brought Harbour Ridge full circle, from exclusion to welcome, from judgment to understanding, from isolation to community. Year to the day after Meryl Streep had first walked into Eleanor's harbour kitchen, the restaurant closed early for a private celebration. The tables had been rearranged into one long communal setting, stretching from the front window to the back. White tablecloths covered the surface, adorned with small vases of wildflowers and candles that cast a warm glow throughout the space. Eleanor stood in the doorway of her kitchen, watching as Sophie directed the final preparations. At 28, her daughter had blossomed into a confident young woman who now managed much of the restaurant's day-to-day operations. Next month, she would begin a part-time culinary program at the State College, a dream she had set aside years ago when the restaurant was struggling and needed her full attention. "Everything looks perfect," Eleanor said, approaching her daughter. Sophie smiled, the resemblance to her father momentarily taking Eleanor's breath away. "Hard to believe it's been a year." "Sometimes it feels like yesterday," Eleanor admitted. "Other times it feels like another lifetime." The anniversary dinner had been Sophie's idea, a way to mark not just the pivotal encounter with Meryl Streep, but all that had unfolded since. The guest list included those who had been integral to Harbour Ridge's transformation. Martha Reynolds, now relying on a wheelchair but sharp as ever, Jackson Barnes and his daughter, who had recently returned to town to help with his fishing business, David Jenkins and other town officials, Rebecca Chen, who had completed her series on Harbour Ridge's revival but still visited regularly, and of course Jennifer Layton from the Streep Foundation. Meryl herself had sent her regrets as she was filming overseas, but had arranged for a surprise that would be revealed during dinner. At precisely 6 o'clock, the guests began to arrive. Eleanor greeted each one personally, struck by how many lives had become intertwined with hers over the past year. Martha Reynolds was wheeled in by her granddaughter, her eyes bright with mischief as she pressed a small package into Eleanor's hands. "Open it later," she instructed with a wink. The atmosphere was festive yet intimate, as everyone settled around the table. Wine was poured, stories were shared, and laughter flowed as freely as the conversation. Eleanor found herself watching the interactions with a sense of wonder. These people, some she had known all her life, others who had entered her world only recently, had become something like family. Midway through the meal, Sophie tapped her glass for attention and stood. "A year ago," she began, "my mother did something she's not particularly proud of." Sophie's gaze met Eleanor's, warm with understanding. She turned away a customer based on a difference of opinion. That customer was Meryl Streep. A knowing murmur rippled through the gathering. Though the story was well known, it still carried a certain weight when acknowledged so directly. "What none of us could have predicted," Sophie continued, "was how that moment would transform not just this restaurant, but all of Harbour Ridge. When Meryl responded with kindness instead of condemnation, she set something in motion that continues to this day." Sophie gestured around the table. "Look at us. A year ago, many of us barely spoke to each other. The lighthouse was crumbling, businesses were closing, and Harbour Ridge was slowly fading away. Now we're planning the expansion of the Maritime Museum. The summer tourist season was our best in 15 years, and there's a waiting list for commercial space on Main Street." She raised her glass. "To Meryl Streep, whose grace gave us a second chance, and to my mother, who had the courage to admit she was wrong and to embrace a new way forward." As glasses clinked around the table, Eleanor felt a swell of emotion. She had never been one for public speaking, but tonight, surrounded by people who had witnessed her at her worst and supported her journey to something better, she found herself standing. "I've spent most of my life believing that standing firm in your convictions meant never changing your mind," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I thought strength came from staying the same no matter what. I was wrong." She looked around at the faces turned toward her, faces that reflected the diversity of Harbour Ridge, from lifelong residents to recent arrivals, all now connected in purpose. "True strength, I've learned, comes from being willing to grow, to reconsider, to build bridges instead of walls. Meryl taught me that with a single act of grace. The rest of you have taught me through your patience, your creativity, and your..." willingness to imagine a different future for Harbour Ridge. As Eleanor concluded, Jennifer Layton stood. "Speaking of the future," she said, "Meryl asked me to share something with you tonight." She opened her tablet and turned it to show the group. On the screen was a formal letter from the Streep Foundation, announcing the establishment of the Mary Streep Culinary Scholarship for Harbour Ridge students, pursuing careers in culinary arts or restaurant management. The first recipient would be selected the following spring. Additionally, Jennifer continued as murmurs of appreciation rippled through the room, Meryl has recorded a message for all of you. She tapped the screen, and suddenly Meryl Streep's face appeared, smiling warmly from what appeared to be a film set somewhere in Europe. "Hello, Harbour Ridge," she greeted, her voice filling the restaurant. "I wish I could be with you tonight to celebrate all you've accomplished this past year. What's happened in your community exemplifies everything my mother believed in, that food brings people together, that second chances matter, and that a single act of kindness can ripple outward in ways we never expect." Eleanor listened, transfixed. As Meryl continued, "The scholarship named for my mother is one way to ensure that her connection to Harbour Ridge continues for generations to come. But the real legacy isn't in a fund or a program. It's in the community you've rebuilt together. It's in Eleanor's courage to grow beyond rigid certainties. It's in Sophie's vision for a restaurant that nourishes both body and community. It's in each of you who chose to see possibilities where others saw only decline." As Meryl's message concluded, the room fell into a thoughtful silence, broken only when Martha Reynolds spoke up from her place at the table. "Mary would be so proud," she said firmly, "of all of us." Later that night, after the guests had departed and Sophie had gone home, Eleanor sat alone at the window table, the same one where Meryl had first intended to dine, where they had later shared their reconciliatory dinner. The Tau. Harbour was visible beyond the glass, boats gently rocking in the moonlight. She unwrapped Martha's small package, revealing a weathered brass key on a faded ribbon. A note explained, "This was the key to the original Harbour kitchen before your parents renovated. Mary Streep and I found it years ago when we were teenagers exploring the abandoned building. She kept it all these years as a reminder of that. Summer, her daughter returned it to me after her passing, and now it belongs with you, the keeper of both its past and its future." Eleanor held the key in her palm, feeling its weight and history. From her mother to Mary Streep to Meryl, and now to her, a tangible symbol of connections that transcended time and misunderstanding. Outside, Harbour Ridge slept peacefully, a town reborn through an unexpected chain of events that began with rejection but transformed into welcome. Eleanor had learned that standing for something didn't have to mean standing against others, that principles were strengthened, not weakened, by the willingness to reconsider them. As she prepared to lock up for the night, Eleanor glanced at the sign above the door. Eleanor's Harbour Kitchen, everyone welcome, it read, a simple phrase that now reflected not just a policy, but a philosophy, not just a business practice, but a way of being in the world. The impact of that philosophy extended far beyond the restaurant's walls. It lived in the restored lighthouse, standing sentinel over the harbour. It thrived in the Maritime Museum, where children now learned about their town's heritage. It flourished in the renewed sense of possibility that infused Harbour Ridge's streets and shops and homes. But perhaps its most profound impact was less visible, the internal transformation of a woman who had discovered that the greatest strength lies not in rigid certainty, but in the courage to grow, to forgive, and to begin again. And in that discovery, Eleanor Wilson had found not just a second chance for her restaurant or her town, but for herself. If you believe in the power of kindness, if you believe that grace and forgiveness can change lives, then be part of this movement. Hit like if Meryl's story moved you. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that prove one act of grace can change the world. Share this incredible journey with friends and family, because the world needs more examples of compassion triumphing over conflict. Let's build more bridges where walls once stood. Let's be the reason someone finds hope again.